an agriculturalist from Reading, was it not?
Bangor.
Close to Reading, and has been an agricultural journalist for the last... We met, didn't we, on Farmers Weekly about 35 years ago. We both worked.
We crossed over.
We crossed
You were
over.
leaving to go to New Scientist just as I joined.
There we are. And he's been one of the really stalwart agricultural journalists ever since, written some excellent books. The Carbon Fields is the latest one. Can I say you were agricultural advisor to the Archers for 20-odd years?
Yes.
Well, I will know he did. And here he is, anyway.
So there we have a modern farming system. Actually, this one's about 200 years old. This picture was painted, I'm sure you know this, Gainsborough painted this in 1750. And you'll see evidence of the latest technology in the drills, which is Jethro Tull's corn drill. This is Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. It hangs in the National Gallery. And they were painted in a studio, and then Gainsborough actually put the landscape on top of it. They lived a few miles away across the Suffolk border. This is actually in North Essex. And I thought I'd show it because this is, 250 years old, 260 years old, and it shows a very productive kind of agriculture. You'll see, as well as the fine wheat crop, you'll see some, perhaps you can't see, but there's some grazing sheep, presumably producing grass-fed mutton, which we now know is a very good food. And this was generally accepted as the starting period, 1750, of the agricultural revolution, which greatly increased the supply of food, and it did it through bringing in new seeds and crop rotations. And the piece of genius was actually mixing grazing animals in a rotation with growing crops. And it's a very productive system of agriculture. It lasted for about 250 years. In fact, 200 years after this picture was painted, one of our leading agricultural scientists of the 20th century, George Stapleton, was actually promoting this kind of agriculture as the way ahead for Britain. He called it ley farming, and he thought it was ideally suited to Britain. It would make a lot of plough-sick, arable land that was lacking in humus. It would bring it back to fertility. And he thought it was preeminently suited to British conditions because it had three essential ingredients. And these were, it produced self-sufficiency, sustained fertility, and flexibility. But of course, this isn't what we've got. Mixed farming, that's what we've got. It's called high input cereal production, high input wheat production. And there are two reasons that we have so much of this in Britain now. The first was a bit of plant breeding technology in the 1950s and 60s, Norman Borlaug and his short-strawed cereal varieties, which is actually conveniently called the Green Revolution. These short-strawed varieties, I remember writing about the first one to come into Britain. It's called Hobbit, short-strawed wheat. But they require very heavy inputs of nitrate fertilizers. And the second reason we have this, apart from technology, is we've had Western governments generally subsidizing this kind of production. We've had that for 30 or 40 years now. So they've actually maintained surpluses of these kind of commodities, and the excesses of surpluses swirled around the world and put a lot of poor farmers out of business. We grow about 16 million tonnes of high-input wheat in this country now. 40% of it goes to feed human beings. And I say feed in very loose terms. It goes into things like bread and pasties and pies and pasta, cakes, biscuits, breakfast cereals, basically all the things that make us ill, all the things that cause obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, some cancers, and heart disease. And if those of you who were here last year may remember Dr. Natasha Campbell-McBride talking about our nutritional problems in the UK, and degenerative diseases are not the fault of saturated fats but are the fault in refined foods, processed foods, particularly processed carbohydrates. And she spoke about driving out from her home in Cambridge and driving around East Anglia and seeing the fields full of wheat and sugar beet, all the things that are making us ill. Anyway, that's where 40% of our grain goes. Another 40% to get rid of this vast surplus of wheat we produce goes to feeding animals. Mostly pigs and poultry, but also a considerable amount of ruminant animals, particularly dairy cows. And the effects that this has on the dairy cow is, A, to make the dairy cow less healthy, but also to make the milk and the dairy foods that come from those cows less healthy for us. It's got lower omega-3s, fewer antioxidants in it, and much less of this magical substance called CLA, which protects against many cancers and heart disease, and which you find in grass-fed ruminant foods. In fact, grass-fed ruminants, beef and dairy cows, produce up to 500% more CLA than those same products from cattle getting a mixture of silage and grain. Which leaves about 20% of our 16 million tonnes of grain crop, and that used to be what used to be called an exportable subsidy, which we used to dump on world markets below the cost of production. Now we tend to invent new subsidised markets for, like turning it into biofuel. And yet when I read my Farmers Weekly, all I read about is the problems that cereal farmers are facing because we've reached now a grain threshold. We can't increase the yield now above something like 8 tonnes a hectare. And this is seen as a big problem. Cereal growers now, they constantly chase yields. It's kind of a big game that they're all in. And it's now seen as a crisis that wheat yields have stagnated at 8 tonnes a hectare. And the biotech people say, well, this shows that we need new technologies to break through this 8-tonne yield barrier. But we don't. As I've shown, I think we're just producing far too much wheat for our own health. And it's not just me that says that there's no global consensus of agricultural scientists who agree. And there was the ISTAD report that many of you will know that came out in 2008. And it showed this kind of agriculture is not only producing too much starch and too much nutrient-depleted food for us to be healthy, but it's also degrading land and squandering water. 1.9 billion hectares of land around the world is degraded. 70% of our water, freshwater abstraction, goes to irrigate grain crops. We have an over-reliance on fossil fuels, and as I've said, we've lost biodiversity, we've got degraded foods, and so on. And the director of that study, Professor Bob Watson, who's Chief Scientific Advisor to DEFRA, I'll just quote from him: "We're putting food on our table that appears cheap, but it's food which is not always healthy and which costs us dearly in terms of water, soil, and the biological diversity on which all our futures depend." The ISTAD report was very clear. It's about the kind of agriculture we needed around the world. It's smaller scale systems that are efficient in their use of water, nutrients and energy. There needs to be a greater involvement in women in these production systems. Agriculture needs to be multifunctional, so it needs to produce not just food but environmental goods, employment, landscape, and increasingly cultural heritage, which is very important to our well-being. And as Colin said, it needs to be biologically diverse, with polycultures replacing monocultures. And the kind of system that would do this is the one we saw to start with, a kind of mixed agriculture, mixed farming. And despite all the hype that we need these high input systems to feed 9 billion people, we could do it quite easily with the kind of systems that Mr. and Mrs. Andrews were practicing in 1750. And Hans Herren, with the privilege of hearing Hans Herren, who's a co-author of that ISTAD report, speaking just recently. And he said it's possible in developing countries very easily to increase food output by 2 to 3 times What gets in the way is our Western model of these surplus grains that we're chucking out, and we're seeing this is the way to feed the world, and it isn't. Finally, I'd like to just refer back to George Stapleton, who I referred to a bit earlier on, who campaigned for mixed farming, or lay farming as he called it, is the way for Britain to go after the last war. He was the founder of the British Grassland Society, a founder president, and he was the first director of the Welsh Plant Breeding Station. And all his life he immersed himself in agricultural science, but towards the end of his life became very disillusioned with it, and instead he just immersed himself in literature and poetry and history. And his fear about agricultural science was that the science is now so focused on technology aimed at controlling nature that he felt it would have catastrophic consequences, especially in agriculture. And I'll end with a quote from George Stapleton to the British Grassland Society. I think it was about 1955. He said, "In putting all our money on narrow specialisation and new technology, we have backed a wild horse. Given its head, it's bound to get out of control. For the first time in my life, I've realised that in agriculture, as in other human affairs, facts and factors on their own mean precisely nothing. It is their mass interrelationships and interactions that mean everything, and they, for all practical purposes, are infinite." And he said what we should be striving for is not new knowledge, not new technology, but using the terms in their broadest sense, learning and scholarship. And when I hear, as we so often hear today, research scientists and politicians saying the future of feeding the world is in new technologies, I wonder if we've taken leave of our senses, frankly. Thank you very much.
We've got a whole minute in hand, and I was wondering if I could take up one little point that Graham made, that this 8 tonnes a hectare, I worked out once, it's not a very difficult calculation, that 1 tonne of wheat will provide 3 people with all the macronutrients, I mean leaving aside whether it's good for you or not, with all the energy and protein that they need for a year. So if you have 8 tonnes per hectare, you can feed 24 people per hectare. Now, according to the government report, John Beddington's latest one, where he says 9.5 billion people now on the earth, and there will be by 2050, and that's going to be very, very difficult. He also, in that report, says there are 4.5 billion hectares of agricultural land in the world, which means we actually need only to feed 2 people per hectare. And yet here we are producing enough for 24 people per hectare, and saying it's not enough, we've got to increase it even more. And you might say, well, this is special, this is East Anglia, I mean, what about the Sahel? Well, even on the Sahel, it's people are looking at 1 tonne per hectare, and 1 tonne per hectare is actually enough to, 1 tonne per hectare is certainly enough to feed, well, a great many more than 2 people per hectare, so, more than 2 people. So you say, well, if you average 2 people per hectare, and you can do that easily, even on the worst land, what is supposed to be the problem? And I don't actually know the answer to that question. What is supposed to be the problem? Well, you're going on the way we're going on, are they going on the way